One more thing, people.
You're going to be asking questions, so you might as well sit up front.
This session is being recorded. Stop.
Okay, do we have everybody? Okay, very good. Okay, so we have Alan Dershowitz, and we have a group of 20 plus excited and ready for a conversation people. If Alan, if you don't mind, the topic of the conversation is actually 3 parts. It is Holocaust, it is anti-Semitism, and it's the state of Israel. If we could,
It's my honor and pleasure to be on with such a distinguished group of people. And so I welcome your questions on any of those subjects.
Very good. Okay, so if we could start with the Holocaust first. So if you don't mind, say a few words about your family and experience of your family with the Holocaust.
Okay.
And then if you can tell us how the subject of Holocaust was also covered in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in the United States, because pretty much everybody in this room were either not born or outside of the United States at that time.
Okay, thank you very much. First, my family's role in the Holocaust. Most of my immediate family emigrated to the United States at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. But my grandfather, who came over in about 1892 or 3, discovered that his grandfather's brother's family were living in Brno, Czechoslovakia, 29 of them. And they couldn't get out. They couldn't be saved. The United States State Department, which was virulently anti-Semitic, refused to give them visas, refused to allow them, even though many of them were highly educated, engineers, doctors, lawyers. They were going to die when the Nazis invaded Czechoslovakia, Brno, Czechoslovakia. And so my grandfather decided to basically break the law to bring over these members of his family. So he went around the neighborhood and told everybody in the neighborhood who had a basement, you now have a shul, a synagogue, and you need a rabbi, you need a rebbitzin, you need a chazan, you need a moil, you need somebody to be in charge of the mikveh, but we have no mikveh, you have a mikveh. And so all of these people filed false and perjured affidavits, committed crimes, in order to help save these 29 people. And on the eve of the Nazi invasion of what was then Czechoslovakia, 28 of them got out and came to the United States, leaving behind one young woman who was studying the violin in Przemyśl, Poland. And my grandfather wouldn't accept that, even one person. And so he sent his oldest unmarried son, my Uncle Milton, who was a rabbi, to the belly of the beast, to Poland, to find this cousin, who was then, I don't know, 18 or 19, and to marry her in a fake marriage and use his American citizenship to bring her over. And so we had a fake marriage in Poland, got on the boat, and actually fell in love with her. And they had a real marriage, and they lived together for 50 years. It's an amazing story. And I'm very proud of my grandfather, who was uneducated and who was very poor, to help save so many people. I have hanging in my wall, I can actually show it to you as we speak, one of the most remarkable documents that I own, and I collect documents. But this document is an actual, as you can see, a Schutzpass. It is an actual pass that signed by Raoul Wallenberg, which saved the life of a particular woman. And I have that in my office to remind me of heroes like Wallenberg. There were too few of them during the Holocaust. When I was growing up, I was born in 1938, and by the time the Holocaust was over, I was seven years old. It was never discussed in school. We knew something terrible had happened to the Jews of Europe. We had many neighbors who had numbers on their hands, neighbors who didn't have sisters but had cousins living with them because their parents had been killed. So we knew, but we didn't know, and we didn't learn about it in school. And I decided to write about it extensively, and I have written about the Holocaust extensively in several of my books. And for me, the two biggest differences between the Shoah, the Holocaust, and every other genocide in the history of the world is two things. Number one, in no other genocide did those who perpetuated the genocide ingather the people to kill them. In every other genocide, the Armenian genocide, other genocides, they killed people who were in the way. They didn't go out of their way to bring people to death camps. But for me, for example, the story of Rhodes, the island in the Mediterranean, is the perfect illustration of the Holocaust. There were 25,000 or so Jews living in Rhodes. They had lived there since the Babylonian exile. They were not fancy or upper class. They were mostly merchants and artisans. And they had nothing to do with life in Europe or with Hitler or with Germany. And yet, when the Nazis took over Rhodes, they put 25,000 people on boats and took them from Rhodes, the little island, to the death camps in order to kill them. So that was one difference between every other genocide in history. The other difference is the emphasis on children. In other genocides, they would often save the children and give them over to other people. In Argentina, they did that. In other places, they did that. But the Nazi genocide, they were determined to rid the world of the genes of the Jews. And so the motto was children first. They wanted to make sure that every child who was Jewish, even partly Jewish, even a quarter Jewish, was killed in order to make sure that the Jewish, quote, race did not survive. So for me, that's the biggest difference, those two, the ingathering and the focus on children, which makes the Holocaust different from every other genocide in the history of the world, and why I'm determined to keep the memory of it alive and to make sure that the world never forgets. The worst thing that ever happened after the Holocaust was the way Germany was treated. There were two approaches that were suggested by American leaders. One was suggested by the Secretary of the Treasury, Morgenthau, and he suggested that Germany not be allowed to rebuild its industry during the lifetime of anybody who was alive during the Holocaust. So for the next 50 or 60 or 70 years, Germany would become an agrarian state. There would be no museums open. There would be no concerts. The whole country would be somehow punished for what it had brought to the world. That was one approach. The other approach was the one that was eventually adopted by the United States. Namely, the Germans were rewarded for killing the Jews. They became the strongest country in Europe, the most economically viable country in Europe. The Marshall Plan was the most immoral decision ever made by a country to reward mass murderers and people who supported mass murder. Now, I understand the need for it. It was the need to prevent Germany from becoming communist. After all, East Germany was communist, West Germany was not. So West Germany was to become a showplace for what happens when you're with the West. But it allowed Hitler's prediction to come true. Hitler said, if we kill the Jews, we will be better off. And he was right. They killed the Jews and they were better off. And that prediction never, ever should have been allowed to come true. And recently there was a poll taken by people all over the world. What are the two best countries in the world? The two best countries, no definition of what's best, but the two best countries in the world. Number one was Germany, number two was Japan. Both countries that had engaged in genocides. Obviously, the German genocide was far, far worse, but the Japanese also engaged in genocide in Korea and in China. And yet these two countries were forgiven in order to fight communism. And the message that was sent to the world was, if you commit horrible crimes like that, if there's a need for it, if there's a pragmatic need for it, don't worry, you will be recorded, you will be rewarded. And I think too few Germans were punished. The leaders were punished, but not very many others were punished. And I think it's what resulted in so many other genocides occurring after we said never again. After we said it would never happen again, it happened again and again and again and again. Never as bad as the Shoah, but of course it's going to happen again. Of course Pol Pot was going to murder so many people in Cambodia because he knew he'd get away with it. And of course we saw the genocides in Africa because they knew they'd get away with it. If the Germans got away with it, oh my God, of course anybody will get away with it. And so I don't think to this day we've ever learned the lesson of the Shoah.
It became sort of a mainstream. Can you hear
I
me?
can't hear. I'm sorry. You have to talk louder. I can't hear you.
It became a mainstream in the 90s, in the 80s, and onward. The Holocaust. Can you talk about what actually, why is that? Is it a particular person like Elie Wiesel, or it was really a society that needed that?
Well, I think it's a combination. I think the basic question is why we didn't talk about it for so many years between 1945 and say 1985. Well, why did we have 40 years where there was really no discussion of the Holocaust? I think Elie Wiesel played a major role. He was a great friend of mine, a very close personal friend. He was my rabbi, even though he wasn't a rabbi. I always went to him for advice, and he occasionally came to me for advice. And I think his book, Night, particularly, brought the Shoah to the memory of so many, particularly young people in school. But I think also the trauma had lifted, and it was now possible to think about the Holocaust and to focus on it. Of course, with that came Holocaust denial. And you had professors, a famous professor at Northwestern University who was a Holocaust denier, a famous Jew who was a Holocaust denier, Gilad Atzmon, and then two professors at the University of Chicago who recently supported Gilad Atzmon, Professor Brian Leitner, professor of jurisprudence at the University of Chicago, and Professor Mearsheimer. So you still have people who are enablers of Holocaust denial, and you still have Holocaust deniers. We're now at a point where I think we're beginning to forget the Holocaust. Remember, by the next decade, by the end of the 2020s, there will probably be no survivors left. They will all be, approximately 100 years old. The stories will be forgotten. And it's important that groups like yours never allow this to be forgotten. There are museums, obviously, but when you go, for example, to Berlin, which has a beautiful Holocaust museum, but Berliners don't go to it. They play on the outside, they jump on the stones, they have no realization. And in many parts of the world, there is no remembrance. I went to the Ukraine not so long ago, and I went to Babi Yar, and there was a tiny little grown over plaque. Now, apparently there's a little bit more, but right in the middle of Kiev, there's a giant statue to Khmelnytsky, who was a predecessor to the Holocaust. He murdered 100,000 Jews in pogroms and was a hero to Hitler. as were the Turkish genocidals in Armenia. So even to this day, we have museums, but we don't have sufficient memory of what really happened. And the idea that you can mechanically set up a process to kill 6 million people, including 1.5 million children, babies, the elderly, Christians, priests were killed because their grandfather or grandmother were Jewish. It didn't matter what your religion was. It was a matter of racism. If you had any Jewish blood, quarter Jewish blood, you were subject to death and execution and murder. And many of the hands-on people who committed these murders lived good lives and died at age 90, surrounded by their children and grandchildren who had no idea, or if they had an idea, didn't care what their grandparents had done.
We have a hard stop at 8, so I think.
I'm sorry, say it again.
We need a microphone, right?
I'm having trouble hearing you.
We have a hard stop at 8, you said, right? We have to
Yes.
stop. So what I would like to do, maybe spend another 10 minutes on the Holocaust, and I'll open up for questions on the subject of Holocaust. Then we will go to anti-Semitism for about 20 minutes, and then a state of Israel for another 20 minutes.
That sounds fine. Yeah, just make sure the questions are clear because I'm having a little trouble hearing.
Okay, so who had a question on the Holocaust? Because I didn't get all of the questions. Oh, was it on the Holocaust?
Do you want to talk about the yard?
I'm ready with the question. So I just recently, to shame of mine, find out about Madagascar plan, which was, do you hear me, attorney?
Do you want to come here? I'm not going to use this now.
So my name is Mike. Hello. And to my shame, I am 54 years young. And about 2 weeks ago, I found out about the existence of Madagascar plan, which is I had to read from Wikipedia. And I learned that in 1937, after Nuremberg laws, but before the Kristallnacht, Polish and French governments came up with an idea to transport all Polish Jews to the French colony of island of Madagascar. So that was really before the Kristallnacht. So at that time, it did look like Nazis, before implementing their Wannsee plan, they were trying to get rid of Jews from Europe, but not really exterminating them. So back then, looked like only Birkenau camp was opened in Bavaria, and that really disturbed me because it looks like the exile, which was kind of like a late copy of Alhambra, the repeat, was implemented not by Germans, but by French and Polish governments. And the thing happened that it didn't go live in 1940 because I had to, I couldn't stop. So I decided to read a little movie about Eichmann and Adolf Eichmann. And the thing is that in his speech defending himself in Israeli trial, he was saying that he was just technical the labor, and he really loved Jews, and he did as much as he could to save them prior to make that final solution, which was took place in Wannsee, to transport all European Jews to extermination. And so the question is,
the question is everybody complicit? I guess that's the question. Is it only Germans, or everybody was complicit?
Everybody, that's what the
Well,
question is.
it's obviously a matter of degree. The most complicit people were the Nazis, the Nazi Party, and the people who facilitated it. But the German people had voted for Hitler, and if Hitler had run again, of course, there were no elections really after 1932, but if there had been an election in 38 or in 40 and 42, Hitler would have gotten 90%, 95% of the vote. So I think the German people as a whole were generally complicit. So were the Americans for refusing to allow refusing to allow people to land in America. The Madagascar plan could never succeed, of course, because it was too early. Why would anybody in Poland ever leave their home? The Jews had lived in Poland for 300-400 years. And there was no thought that Germany would invade Poland, no thought that Germany would build death camps in Poland. This was completely unanticipated. But there was a major failure of Jewish leadership. For example, again, to go back to Rhodes, if the Jewish leaders had anticipated what was going to happen to the 25,000 Jews in Rhodes, all they had to do was warn them. It's, I think, 4 miles from Rhodes to the border of Turkey. They could have rode there and escaped. And there are so many other Jews who could have escaped and made it. It was also the fault of the British that closed Palestine to Jewish immigration. So, the entire world was complicit. And let me tell you about one group that was more complicit than any other group other than the Nazis themselves, and that is the Palestinians. The Palestinian leadership at the time was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was an ally of Hitler. He went to Germany and lived in Berlin under Hitler's auspices and created plans to build death camps in Hebron and in other parts of what was then Palestine. And he prevented Jews from leaving Europe and escaping to Palestine. Of course, Jews didn't know whether they'd be safe in Palestine at the time because the Germans under Rommel were in North Africa. And had they not lost the battle of Al Iman in Egypt, maybe the Germans would have gotten to Palestine and murdered some hundreds of thousands of Jews who were living there at the time. So, history is blind and deaf to the future. It only knows about the past. And we can speculate all we want, but there's enough fault to go around. And I think the world as a whole is responsible. You couldn't have the Shoah without complicity by virtually the entire world. Let me give you another country, Holland. Everybody looks to Holland and says, oh, what a wonderful country. It harbored Jews and it kept them there. The Dutch were among the most complicit. There were many, many Nazis in Holland, many Aryans and many people who supported Hitler. And many people turned in Jews. Even Jews turned in Jews. There Gertrude Stein, a great writer who's taught today in feminist schools, was somebody who lived openly as a Jew in occupied France because her best friend was the head of the Gestapo. And it is reported, I don't know that there's evidence to support it, but there are reports of it, that she turned in Jews and Jewish children who were hiding. She nominated Hitler for a Nobel Peace Prize. She wrote the introduction to a book by the head of the occupation, glorifying Nazism, essentially. This is Gertrude Stein. So there's so much, so many writers and poets and artists supported Nazism. And we've forgiven them all, unfortunately, or most of them, and even history has forgiven them, and that's a tragedy.
So to finish the last few minutes, on the subject of the Holocaust, can you talk about what do you think is happening today with the narrative? And when I say today, I mean in the United States with the Holocaust.
I think the narrative is weakening. I think that politically, other groups, African Americans and others, are saying, oh, we've all had our Holocausts. the Holocaust is only a matter of degree. Yeah, the Holocaust was bad. Slavery was just as bad. The Japanese exclusion was just as bad. The way in which we treat Latino people at the border is just as bad. Well, all of those are bad, but nothing compares in any way to the willful and deliberate decision to murder as many Jews as possible with the youngest first, and to bring them from all over the world and ingather them so that they can be killed. And so I think we're seeing a lot of comparativism between the Holocaust and other disasters and genocides, and we should never allow that kind of comparison. And there are people, who foolishly talk about, for example, vaccine mandates. Oh, vaccine mandates are just like the Holocaust. If you make somebody carry around a vaccine passport, it's just like wearing a yellow star. That's a form of Holocaust denial or minimization, because if there was nothing worse in the Holocaust than carrying around a vaccine mandate, how bad could it have been? And so we have to discourage those kinds of comparisons and make sure that the Holocaust remains unique in world history as something that was worse than anything in the history of humankind.
Okay, so unless we have any other question on the Holocaust, I don't think we. I'm sorry?
Yeah, I have a question if I can ask.
Sure.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Why was, well, first of all, thank you very much for coming here. And
Sure, thank you for inviting me.
Why was the American jury silent in saving the European Jews before the Holocaust and silent standing for Israel even today? So if we think of St. Louis ship, where no one on the American jury side came out and asked for the ship to be disembarked, and still Jews voted for Roosevelt. Yep. And the same thing today, American Jews do not stand for Israel. I'm talking about 80%.
So a lot of Jews stand up for Israel, but Jews are like anybody else. They put their own interests first, their own parochial interests first. I'll give you an example from my own history. You've probably all heard of the 92nd Street Y. It's the most important place where Jewish speakers are invited to speak. And for many years, I was the second most popular speaker at the 92nd Street Y. Elie Wiesel was the first most popular speaker. I was the second most popular speaker. And a couple of years ago, the 92nd Street Y, which is home to Holocaust deniers, which is home to BDS supporters, which is home to the worst kind of anti-Jewish rhetoric, blackballed me and said, I can no longer ever speak in the 92nd Street Y. And so I wrote a book called Defending Israel, a very strong book, which would be very important on college campuses to defend Israel. And the 92nd Street Y refused to allow me to speak. And will never again allow me to speak. If Elie Wiesel were alive today, he would never set foot in the 92nd Street Y as a result of that. And the 92nd Street Y purported to ban me because I was falsely accused in the Jeffrey Epstein case of having sex with a woman I never met. And I disproved it without any doubt. And there's nobody serious who believes that it's true. And the 92nd Street Y said, well, we don't believe it. We don't think it's true, but you're controversial. And so you can't any longer speak. And so I've been banned by the 92nd Street Y. And I've been banned by a number of other Jewish institutions and synagogues. I have been canceled and blackballed as a result of it. And with all due modesty, I am probably the most effective pro-Israel speaker in the world today, certainly outside of Israel, on college campuses and in other places. And yet leaders of the Jewish community are blackballing me and preventing me from speaking on colleges, in synagogues, and in other places. And it's unfortunately all too typical of the way Jewish leadership operates. They're so worried about their status that if there's anything controversial, no, we don't want to be involved in that. It's a disgrace. It hurts Israel. It hurts Jewish values. And it makes me understand how Jews could remain silent in the face of the Holocaust. What they were worried about is their own selves and their own status in America, and they couldn't care less about their brothers and sisters abroad. The New York Times refused to write about the Holocaust. They buried a few stories on page 28 because they didn't want to be perceived as supporting their own people. And I think that's happening today at the 92nd Street Y and other venues. And in fact, I'm writing a book about it. It's called The Price of Principle, in which I name names of Jewish institutions that have blackballed me and others and prevented us from making the case for Israel, making the case about the Holocaust, and protecting and defending Jewish values.
Thank you. I just wanted to remind you that the RJCF, the Russian Jewish Community Foundation, awarded you the Jewish Leadership Award 10 years ago. So thank you.
I remember it. I'm very grateful for that. And I wish the Jewish communities would protest to the 92nd Street Y. Maybe they'll listen to them. They won't listen to me.
Thanks.
I think we have one more question. No, okay, on the next question. Okay, so I think I wish we have more time, but I think we will move from a subject of Holocaust right now to the subject of anti-Semitism. Now when it is on the rise and expressed publicly, some of us feel that the next big tragedy is really not when, actually not if, but rather when and where. So what would you say on the subject of anti-Semitism? And we will go into questions after that.
Okay, anti-Semitism today is more dangerous than any time in my adult life. Why is it so dangerous? We've always had anti-Semitism. We've always had anti-Semitism from the right. Neo-Nazis, extreme conservatives have always had some anti-Semitism, but they were always the past. They were always the older people. What's so scary now is that anti-Semitism is coming from young people. It's coming from college campuses, from university campuses, from university professors. And therefore, it's the future, not the past. And it's become justified. It's justified as anti-Zionism, but it's not anti-Zionism. Singling out the nation state of the Jewish people for criticism while not saying anything about much, much, much worse human rights violations by China, by Cuba, by Belarus, by some African countries, by Turkey, by Iran, is anti-Semitism, pure and simple. And because it comes from the left and because it comes from young people, it's far, far more dangerous because these young people are going to be the leaders in 10 years, and they will bring with them their attitudes that they learned in today's college classes, which tolerate anti-Semitism. Let me just give you a small example from the New York City school system. So there was a teacher in the New York City school system that saw a bunch of other teachers and administrators in the schools wearing Black Lives Matter t-shirts. Okay, so he came to school one day wearing a t-shirt, "I'm a proud Zionist," and he was banned. And they said, that's political. You can't espouse Zionism in the school. The school's non-political. And he said, fine, I won't espouse Zionism, but you can't allow teachers to espouse Black Lives Matter, which is an organization that is anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist. Black Lives Matter organization, not the concept. I think we all support the concept. We know that Black Lives matter, but the organization of Black Lives Matter says that Israel is a genocidal and an apartheid state. And so how can you allow teachers to wear Black Lives Matter t-shirts and not allow them to wear a proud Zionist t-shirt? And yet that's approved of by most people. The double standard that's applied today to Jews and to combating anti-Semitism. Today, anti-Semitism is not high on the agenda of many organizations. because it's no longer coming predominantly from the right. It's coming from the left, which means it's coming, and young people, which means it's coming from our nephews and nieces, our friends' children, sometimes even our own children who have lower tolerance for has greater tolerance for anti-Semitism than they would for comparable anti-Black, anti-gay, anti-Latino sentiments. And we have to have the same rules for all. And so anti-Semitism today is far more dangerous because of its sources and the potential for it to continue into the future.
Is there silver lining?
Say it again.
Is there silver lining? Is there
Is there a silver lining?
Yeah.
No,
Yes. No?
I don't think there's a silver lining. I think it's all bad. I don't think there's anything good about it. I mean, you might say, a friend of mine once wrote an article in the New York Times saying a little anti-Semitism is good because it brings Jews together. I don't agree with that. I don't think we should tolerate any anti-Semitism.
Any?
I have one.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Mr. Dershowitz, can you hear me?
Sure, yeah.
I just want to say it's an honor to meet you. Thank you so much
Thank you.
for speaking today. I feel like there's a environment today where people ignore anti-Semitism. They actively ignore stories of Orthodox Jews being beat in the streets of Brooklyn.
right.
They
Yep.
ignore stories of Torahs being ripped up at the George Washington University, my alma mater. But they focus on stories of violence against Asians perpetrated by supposed white supremacists. How do we get people to recognize the problem that anti-Semitism is today, and to recognize that despite, some of us being white, that we are still a persecuted minority in today's modern society?
It's a great question. We just have to be persistent. We have to never ignore a single instance of anti-Semitism, never allow it to be ignored, put it high on the agenda, report every single case to the proper authorities, get the Anti-Defamation League to become even more active than it already is in reporting and opposing anti-Semitism, and not allowing anti-Zionism to be disguised as politically acceptable criticism of Israel. Nobody cares if anybody criticizes Israel's policies. Everybody in Israel criticizes Israel's policies. It's criticizing the existence of the nation state of the Jewish people, or applying a double standard to them than to any other country in the world. And that's the fight we have to continue. We have to keep it high on the agenda. We have to make sure that law enforcement is as vigorous in going after anti-Semitism as they are in going after other antis and other groups that reflect bigotry. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy, but we have to be persistent.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, I'll read one question that someone from the audience sent me, and I think it's a good question for discussion at least. I'll read the question. How is appropriate for Jews who found a safe haven in the United States try to get involved in politics? Per my knowledge, none of previous experiments went well for our brothers, namely Russian and German revolutions are the most obvious two cases.
I think America is different. Take, for example, the current administration. So we have as the president, Joe Biden, who has had a wonderful relationship with the Jewish community over the years, and a wonderful relationship with Israel. He's been somewhat critical of some policies. But consider who the top 4 people in his administration are. Chief of Staff, Jewish. Secretary of State, Jewish. Secretary of the Treasury, Jewish. Attorney General, Jewish. Head of Homeland Security, Jewish. I mean, what other country in the world has ever had as many Jews? And, Biden didn't pick them because they're Jewish. He picked them because they were the most qualified and they happen to be Jewish. Until recently, 1/3 of the Supreme Court, Jewish. Now, there are two Jews on the Supreme Court. But this is different than it was in Germany, which had quotas. But there are those who would try to reintroduce quotas in the name of affirmative action and diversity. And we have to fight against that and make sure that a Jew is never discriminated against because he's Jewish. The United States Constitution, the first one in the history of the world, ever to say no religious test shall ever be imposed for holding office under the United States. George Washington wrote a letter to the synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, saying of bigotry we will no longer tolerate. Every group, every Jew will be treated as a first-class citizen. This is when England and France and other countries in the world still had laws prohibiting a Jew from serving in the parliament. Remember that when Disraeli became the Prime Minister of England, he could only become a member of parliament because his family had converted from Judaism to Anglicanism. At the time, Britain had a law that required you to swear allegiance to Jesus in order to serve in the parliament. But George Washington said, no, that couldn't happen here. And right from the beginning of our history, we had senators and others who were Jewish. Now, it didn't operate in all areas of life. I have to brag a little, and it's a part of my story. I'll start by saying I was a terrible student in high school. I went to yeshiva. I was not fond of the rabbis, and they were not fond of me. But then I went to college. I went to Brooklyn College, and I was the top of my class. And then I went to Yale Law School, and I was first in my class. I was editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Journal. I was a Supreme Court law clerk, and yet I got turned down by 32 out of 32 of the Wall Street law firms that came to interview at Yale Law School. They just wouldn't hire the son of an Eastern European Jewish family. And I couldn't get a job on Wall Street. I did get a job teaching at Harvard Law School, which I thought was better, but nonetheless, discrimination was still rampant among law firms. This is 1962, not 1792 or 96 when Washington wrote his famous letter. So, we've had this for a long, long time, but we're in a much better situation today. Jews today do have a lot of individual Jews, not the Jews. Anytime anybody talks about the Jews controlling this or the Jews in government, the 5 Jews that are on the top of the Biden administration probably didn't even know each other. They're not some part of some cabal. They're just 5 individuals who are extremely well qualified to hold office, who happen to be picked by a president who doesn't discriminate against Jews, but it doesn't show Jewish control. The 5 Jews probably have very different attitudes toward Israel. By the way, the Secretary of State is the adopted son of Sam Pizar, who was a Holocaust survivor, who barely made it out of Auschwitz alive. He was a friend of mine. I knew him well. He died a few years ago. He was the leading lawyer in France, and people used to call him the Alan Dershowitz of France, and people called me the Sam Pizar of America. So I was always very, very pleased. But he's our Secretary of State now. And he hasn't had to renounce his religion the way Disraeli did. So we're in a very different situation. As far as these revolutions are concerned, you're absolutely right. Jews have always played a leading role in revolutions and then often been hurt by the revolutions themselves, particularly, obviously, the Russian Revolution. Many Jews were Mensheviks, some were Bolsheviks, and of course, Stalin then decided he had to kill so many of the Jews, and that's been true of many other revolutions as well. So we have to be careful. And the other point is Jews should always try to have the governments move to the center. Extremists, right-wing or left-wing extremists, have always been bad for the Jewish community. The Jewish community thrives at the center and it loses at the extremes.
Alan, we have another question from the youngest in the audience.
Good.
Try to speak up.
Hi, Mr. Dershowitz, can you hear me?
I can't hear you. Sorry, can't hear you.
Uh,
Can you hear me now?
A little better. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I've been taught about the Holocaust my whole life, and and I also read the book Night, and it really opened my eyes, but it was not a required reading at my school. So kind of going back to what you said about the rise of anti-Semitism in young people, do you think that the like very small amount of education on the topic nowadays is a reason for the rise?
I do. I think that, number one, and number two, this new attempt to try to indoctrinate students with critical race theory, some of which is very anti-Semitic, others of which, although not anti-Semitic in intent, is anti-Semitic in effect, because it calls for quotas, it calls for diversity training that make people feel guilty for being white and being Jewish. So yeah, I do think that our educational system today, which is moving away from education and toward propaganda, is not good for the Jews. You know, for 50 years I taught at Harvard. I never told a student in class what my opinion was on anything. That wasn't relevant. I didn't teach students what to think. I taught them how to think. I wanted to make conservatives better conservatives, liberals better liberals. And so what we're hearing now instead is indoctrination and propaganda. And some of it is anti-Semitic. For example, you say Night is not required, but there have been some writers whose works are required who have been anti-Semitic, who have written about Jews in a negative way. And you know, we don't ban them, but we ban sometimes writers who write about African Americans in ways that are sometimes negative. Again, we have to have a single standard. If you begin to ban writings by people who are anti-Black, then you have to start banning Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky was a rabid anti-Semite. One of the greatest writers in the world. I love Dostoevsky's writing. I every couple of years go back and read the Brothers Karamazov and Crime and Punishment. But the man was a raving anti-Semite. His essay on the Jewish question could have been written by Hitler or Goebbels. And so, you know, we have all this confusion. Great writers who are anti-Semitic. Ezra Pound was an anti-Semite. As I told you, Gertrude Stein, Jewish, was an anti-Semite. And so we have to have one standard. My standard would be let students read everything, but you can't have restrictions on anti-Black writers without also having comparable restrictions on anti-Jewish writers.
Thank you, Max. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think I will speak for everybody in this room. And if we can spend another 2 minutes, I'd love to pick your brain on a question that was asked before, because I think it's on everybody else's mind. If it's not, many feels that it's not a question of if, it's a question of when and where. And you said that American society is different, the country is different. You made the point there are 5 top people in the Biden administrations that are Jews, which you point as a plus. Some might say it's a minus. But why is this country, why is this night any different than the previous? We've seen it before in Germany, we've seen it before in Russia. How is this country any different?
Okay, we have not seen this before. We have not seen this before in Germany. We have not seen this before in Russia. Both in Germany and Russia, Jews were pervasively discriminated against. Even in the 1920s, the great era of Jewish success in Germany, Weimar Germany, There were quotas. There was anti-Semitism. France had the Dreyfus case. And Russia, we know, although there were individual Jews who made it to the top, they were self-hating Jews. I mean, to compare Trotsky, for example, who was a horrible human being, hated Jews, hated Jewish values, hated Israel wasn't established yet, but Zionism, and all of that. You can't compare him to current leaders. I don't think there's any comparison between Russia and Germany on the eve of their anti-Semitism and in the United States. In the United States also, we have structural protections. We do have separation of church and state. Yesterday, you may remember, 2 days ago, the former National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn, made a stupid statement in which he said, if America is going to be one nation under God, it has to have one God and one religion. So I have an article today in the New York Daily News calling that disgustingly anti-American. It's not right, and it's been rejected by almost everybody on the Republican side and on the Democratic side. So I think we are a very different country. We're also a country that just doesn't have a history of anti-Semitism the way France, England, Germany, Poland, Russia, all of Europe. Look, Theodor Herzl was one of the most brilliant prophets in the world. I always rank Herzl, along with Jeremiah and the great prophets of the Bible. Herzl saw what others didn't see. He saw it during the Dreyfus trial, that there was no future for Jews in Europe. Jews would never be counted as first-class citizens in Europe. I wish every Jew had listened to him and had moved out of Europe when Herzl was still alive. As you know, he died very young in 1904 or something like that. But he understood that Europe was different. And he didn't write that about America because he knew America was not like Europe. And many of the people who left Europe and came to America were saved, but those who went back, I have cousins who were in Palestine, and one part of the family didn't come, and they stayed, and they were all murdered. So I think it's a mistake to assume it's inevitable that Jews will be treated in the United States the way they were treated in Russia and Germany and Poland. The history is very different, and we have to be on our guard to make sure that that's the case. But I certainly would not make that assumption. I would still tell people from Europe, there are only two places that you can be absolutely sure you'll be safe. One is Israel, and the other is the United States. And I myself would urge people who have been victims of anti-Semitism, particularly in parts of France, to think seriously about making Aliyah or coming to the United States. France is the largest community of Jews in the world after the United States and Israel, but things are not going well, particularly among poor Sephardic areas of France, which have been subject to lots and lots of anti-Semitism. Not so much by indigenous French Protestants, but much more by people who came from North Africa and other Arab and Muslim areas. Without making any racial and religious generalizations, that's a reality that people in France tell me about and are aware. So we have to be on our guard, we have to watch out, but I do not believe that the issue is not whether, but when. I don't think that we will see anything like what happened in Germany and Russia happening in the United States, but it requires that we be on our guard. And remember, you don't need only to prevent the most extreme. Just having an increase in anti-Semitism among young people is bad enough, even if it doesn't result in putting our lives in physical danger.
We have another question from Vera. Can you speak up?
Hi, Mr. Dershowitz, can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
How can we change the narrative around Israel? There are many now that pervert the English language and use the verbiage of the Holocaust against Israel. They
Right.
accuse it of the genocide. They accuse it of being an apartheid state. And I personally have such a hard time arguing with friends, people that I thought that I loved and respected about this topic. It's painful for me personally, and I know, many others. So how do you do it?
Well, it's a very hard question. And the first thing we do is insist that Jewish organizations like the 92nd Street Y and other large synagogues, which welcome people who deny Israel the right to exist, won't allow me to speak and make the case against Israel as an apartheid or genocidal nation. So these Jewish organizations are shooting themselves in the foot in order to help a little bit of fundraising. They're prepared to throw me and others under the bus and prevent us from making the case for Israel. And when I'm prevented by the 92nd Street Y from making the case for Israel, it makes it easier for colleges to say, look, Dershowitz can't even speak at the 92nd Street Y. How can we allow him to speak on our campus? So it has a multiplier effect. We have to make sure that our voice and pro-Israel voices are heard in every venue, in every college, in every university, and particularly in every Jewish venue. So we have to change the narrative. We have to make sure that the truth comes out. All I can do is write books. I wrote The Case for Israel. I wrote Defending Israel. I've written 6 or 7 other books and probably 100 articles, probably more, probably 200 or 300 articles defending Israel. That's all I can do. I'm 83 years old. So I don't have the energy that you young folks have to do more than write. But as long as the good Lord gives me the power to write and speak, I will continue to do that as long as I'm allowed to speak. But if Jewish venues forbid me and others from speaking, that's going to be part of the problem.
Thank you.
I think we're moving into Israel, but we may have questions on the other subjects. Go ahead.
Mr. Dershowitz, 2 questions. First, you have been pretty consistent in your position on Israel over the course of decades. Also, you belong to a certain elite strata of the society, which is less consistent on the subject of Israel over time. Do you personally feel difference in the way you as an individual are treated by the circle you belong to over the last several years for your consistency on Israel position? This is first
Yes,
question.
and that's why I'm writing a book called The Price of Principle. It's all about what happens when you stick with principles. Today, people don't believe in principles. They just believe in partisanship. And so because I defended President Trump on the floor of the Senate, I have been canceled by many of my old friends, liberal friends, people whose kids I got into college, people whose kids I represented, people whose parents I represented free of charge. I do half of my cases pro bono. These people have abandoned me and canceled me because they didn't like the fact that I defended President Trump. And I defended President Trump for several reasons. Number one, most important, because his constitutional rights and our constitutional rights were violated by impeaching him for acts which are not impeachable under the Constitution. But also, I first met President Trump when he asked me for my advice on Israel. And I helped with the Abraham Accords. I helped with the peace process. I helped with communications between Israel and the United States. And for that reason, many of my friends on the left abandoned me and attacked me and condemned me and wouldn't talk to me and isolated me. And you have to have courage. You have to stand up for your principles. I'm going to continue to stand up for my principles about Israel and about everything else without regard to what it might cost me. I have a thick skin, but these are people who have also canceled my wife and my son and other relatives of mine who have suffered consequences as the result of my sticking to principles and supporting Israel and supporting the Constitution. But I'll continue to do it.
The second question, my 25 years old son is a big fan of YouTube video of your debate with Mayor Kahane many years ago. Did your attitude toward Meir Kahane evolve over the period of time? Do you think of him the same way and his philosophy the same way today as you used to think before?
It's a great question. Meir Kahane and I go back a long way in our family. My grandfather, who had a small ring store, my grandfather's name was Ringel. Probably they had rings in their family going back to Europe. But he sold the engagement ring to Meir Kahane's parents that resulted in their marriage and Meir Kahane being born. And then I went to the same high school as Meir Kahane. He was 4 years ahead of me. He was head of the debate society at Brooklyn Talmudical Academy, and I was the head of the debate society at Brooklyn Talmudical Academy. I also represented him. I was his lawyer. I also represented other members of the Jewish Defense League, including in a murder case, a multiple murder case. And so I had a very close connection with Meir Kahane. I've always thought his questions were very good. I didn't like his answers. I didn't like his advocacy of violence against Palestinians and against others, particularly against civilians. And so I was not a supporter of his views. One of the people I admire most in the world is Zev Jabotinsky. And of course, Kahane regarded himself as a great supporter of Jabotinsky, but Jabotinsky drew lines that Kahane didn't draw. He didn't believe in attacking innocent civilians, and he didn't believe in violence except as a last recourse. So my views of Kahane haven't changed. I spoke to Kahane the Thursday night before the Monday in which he was murdered. I was his lawyer. I was representing him in an effort to try to get him to be able to speak at Brandeis University. And I was very upset and shocked when he was murdered in cold blood. And I have mixed feelings toward him, but I never supported his means. I do support many of his ends, but you can watch the debate. And I think my views are fairly similar today to what they were back in, I don't remember, 25 years ago.
Okay, so I'm looking around the room for questions. Because I have another question.
Sure.
If you don't mind going back to the colleges, anti-Semitism on colleges, and those ignoramuses with PhDs that are teaching our children, and there is no way to avoid colleges, right? You can school children at home, but then not in college. So what do you see is going to happen? How can we reverse the tide? Well,
let me give you an example. There's a very good high school in New York called the Ramaz School. It's a great high school, and it sends kids to Harvard and to Yale because it's an excellent school. And so the headmaster called me and asked me if I would speak to the students at Ramaz and give them guidance as to how to deal with anti-Israel and anti-Semitism on colleges. He said I was the most obviously expert person on that, having taught at Harvard 50 years and having taught at lectured at many other colleges. And so I agreed to pro bono, without any fees or expenses, to come and speak to the students and give them advice. And then the headmaster called me and said, sorry, we can't have you. You've been canceled. And so again, forget about me. I can speak all over the world. The headmaster denied his students the right to hear me and my views, giving them advice about college. And that's unacceptable. And he should be rebuked for that. Maybe he'll allow me to speak now. I don't know. But at the moment, I have been canceled and banned by the Ramaz school. There's something very, very, very wrong with that. I think we have to prepare our students. Nobody should refuse to go to college. You can go to good schools without being influenced by these propaganda-like professors. Many schools have very strong pro-Israel advocacy groups on the campus, Stand With Us, Chabad, Hillel, others. So you can be very strongly pro-Israel on campus and not become part of, I would suggest two things though. do not take courses from professors who are virulently anti-Israel. And that includes some professors who teach in the Jewish studies program. Some Jewish studies programs around the country in colleges have become very anti-Semitic, just like some Middle East programs like in Columbia have become very anti-Semitic. So you need people like me to give the students guidance what to do, but Ramah's school has said, no, we're not going to let Dershowitz give our students guidance because he's been canceled. We don't believe any of the reasons why he's been canceled are true, but we have a few fundraisers and a few contributors and a few what Jews call machas who don't want Dershowitz speaking. And so we're going to listen to the handful of machas and deny our hundreds of students the ability to listen to 50 years of experience on how to deal with anti-Semitism on campus. It's an absolute disgrace.
All right. Do we have the hard stop at 8? Because I
At 8, yeah. So we have one more time for one more question.
I would love to ask
Well,
one more.
I guess the question, I'm sorry. The question that I guess the last question that I would ask is the following. A few years ago, you were on a program. I can't recall now the name, but you picked a one-way ticket to 1932 Germany.
Right, I remember that. Yeah.
You remember that? Well,
Yeah.
one of the questions was, who would you pick if you can pick the team? Who would you pick? And you picked a number of names, and Elie Wiesel was one of them, and there was a few other names. So now, who would you pick? And give us an advice. Who would you pick today as a younger generation that are still have some, energy and expertise to fight? Who is our guidance going forward?
Well, I'm very worried that, Elie Wiesel and I and Erwin Cutler, Elie died, he was, 88 or 89, I'm 83, Erwin Cutler is 81 or 2. And the three of us used to worry about who are our successors, what's the next generation? And there are some very, very good people out there, and we need to encourage them, young people. Joel Pollack, who was very active in Breitbart, is one such person. There are others as well. I don't want to start naming too many names because I will leave out some, but there are people in their 30s and 40s. Barry Weiss is very effective. Brad Stevens is very effective. Mitch Weber, who was in the White House counsel's office under Trump, is very effective. David Marcus. I can name names, but your community has to turn out people as well. And I'm happy to mentor them. If there are people who are young and want to try to take over from us old folks, I would be happy to advise them. I tried to do it with Ramaz, they wouldn't let me, but your organization seems a lot more open. And so I'd be happy to do that. The important point is you have to use your own experiences. Many of you are emigres from the former Soviet Union. You experienced hostility and anti-Semitism, as you know. I spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union in the 1970s. I represented Sharansky, I represented Sakharov's wife, I represented dissidents who were sentenced to death in the Soviet Union. I spent a lot of time, and I have enormous appreciation for the people who survived the Soviet Union and became, were no longer the Jews of silence, they were the Jews of immigration, and many came to America and contributed greatly to our country. Others went to Israel and contributed greatly to that country. Others went to Canada and Germany and France and England. The Russian Jewish community, the former Soviet Jewish community, is one of the great communities in the world. And it should be turning out great leaders. I was so thrilled to hear young people asking me questions, and please keep asking me questions, keep writing to me, and I'm happy to help mentor you and guide you to leadership roles in the Jewish community in the future. So it's been a great honor for me to speak to this community, and I thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry I have to leave now, but I have another commitment shortly after 8. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Very much. And
Very much.
very much.
Okay, thank you. And will you please send me a recording of this so I can circulate it to people? And I think they'll be very interested in hearing it.
We will definitely send you a recording, and I will forward, if you don't mind, I will give the email that I used to a few younger people.
Sure.
They couldn't be in the audience, but they will clearly need a mentor like you to guide them, and they are trying to take that path in their life. They're in their
Happy to do it.
20s. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be well, everybody.